Hank had been on the road for decades, but that night, exhaustion got the best of him. He pulled into a quiet truck stop, locked his doors, and dozed off in his sleeper cab. But as he slept, masked men crept toward his truck, guns drawn, ready to strike. Big mistake. If you love stories about tough-as-nails truckers, real justice, and unexpected twists, hit subscribe now. Don't miss the next jaw-dropping tale, because the road is full of surprises. Stay tuned. The diesel engine purred softly as the truck idled in the dim glow of the gas station lights. The old Peterbilt sat at the far end of the lot, its trailer casting a long shadow against the cracked pavement. Inside the cab, Earl Big Dog Mattis lay on his bunk, one arm tucked beneath his head, the other resting near the dashboard. A trucker for nearly 4 decades, he had crossed every road in America, hauling loads through snowstorms, tornadoes, and deserts. But tonight, he wasn't thinking about the road. He was just trying to catch a few hours of sleep before sunrise. The lot was quiet, save for the occasional hiss of an air brake or the distant rumble of an approaching semi. The truck stop, a small, run-down station off a lonely desert highway, had seen better days. The neon sign above the main building flickered inconsistently, barely illuminating the dusty pumps below. Earl was no stranger to rough stops like this. They weren't places for comfort. They were places for necessity. Fill up the tank, grab a coffee, stretch your legs, and move on. He always made sure to park near the edge, away from the main crowd. Less chance of trouble that way. But trouble didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it came creeping in the dark. In the distance, a set of headlights shut off abruptly. A blacked-out van rolled slowly into the lot, its tires crunching against the gravel as it maneuvered toward the parked semis. 3 figures emerged, dressed in black tactical gear, their faces obscured by masks. They moved with purpose, their boots barely making a sound against the pavement. Inside his sleeper, Earl stirred slightly, his instincts twitching. Something felt off. A lifetime on the road had tuned him into the smallest disturbances, an engine that didn't sound quite right, a truck stop that felt too quiet, a movement in the shadows where there shouldn't be one. The masked men advanced toward the rear of Earl's truck, their eyes darting around the lot. One of them gestured toward the trailer, and another nodded in response. They crept toward the locked doors, hands hovering over the weapons strapped to their chests. One of them, a lanky man with a military-style vest, turned toward the others and whispered, "Let's make this quick." Another masked figure, gripping a pistol with a silencer attached, climbed onto the back of the truck. He reached for the lock, ready to cut it open, when suddenly a low creak came from inside the trailer. The man froze. Something moved inside. The other 2 robbers glanced at each other, their posture stiffening. Earl's breathing remained slow and steady as he lay on the mattress, eyes still closed. But his right hand now rested on the grip of the sawed-off shotgun he kept stashed beneath his blanket. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to rob him, but it would damn sure be their last. The masked man on the back of the truck hesitated, his gloved fingers hovering over the lock. The night air was still, thick with tension. He turned his head slightly, listening. Inside the sleeper cab, Earl Big Dog Mattis remained motionless, his breathing even, his grip tightening around the sawed-off shotgun hidden beneath his blanket. He had been in situations like this before. Truck stops were magnets for desperate men looking for an easy score. But they had picked the wrong truck tonight. The second masked man, the one with the silenced pistol, whispered harshly, "What's the holdup?" "There's movement inside," the first man muttered. "Probably a stray cat or some junk rolling around," the third one said, shifting the rifle on his shoulder. "Just cut the damn lock." The first man hesitated, but pulled out his bolt cutter, clamping it onto the lock. Just as he started to squeeze, a deep, gravelly voice rang out from inside the sleeper cab. "That's a mistake, son." The 3 men tensed. The man on the truck jerked his head toward the others. "What the?" Before he could finish, the sleeper door burst open. Earl moved like a shadow, swift and efficient. He kicked the door outward, slamming into the nearest gunman, sending him sprawling to the ground. In the same motion, he brought up his shotgun and leveled it at the second man. Boom! The blast ripped through the silence of the truck stop. The second gunman barely had time to react before buckshot tore into his vest, throwing him backward onto the pavement. The third man, the one with the rifle, scrambled for cover behind a nearby fuel pump, cursing as he reached for his radio. "Shit! We got a problem! The old man's packing!" Earl racked the shotgun, stepping down from the truck, his boots crunching against the asphalt. His ice-blue eyes locked onto the last man standing. "You boys ain't too bright, are you?" The first gunman groaned from the ground, clutching his ribs. The second one lay motionless, his vest absorbing most of the damage, but he wasn't getting up anytime soon. The third man's hands were shaking as he pointed his rifle toward Earl. Earl smirked, shifting his shotgun ever so slightly. "Go ahead, kid. Make a decision." The gunman hesitated. His finger hovered over the trigger, but something about the old trucker's stance, his calm, unwavering presence, sent a chill down his spine. "You ain't some regular driver," the gunman muttered, his voice shaking. Earl took a step closer. "Nah, son. I'm the kind of man you wish you hadn't met." The gunman's hands trembled. Then, he turned and ran. Earl exhaled, lowering his shotgun. The night fell silent once more, save for the distant hum of highway traffic. A moment later, a trucker from a few rows over peeked out from behind his rig. "Jesus, Earl. You good?" Earl slung his shotgun over his shoulder and smirked. "I ain't lost a fight yet." The night air was thick with the scent of diesel and burnt rubber. The gunman who had taken cover behind the fuel pump was breathing hard, his knuckles white around his rifle. Earl Mathis, the so-called old trucker, stood calm, his sawed-off shotgun still warm from the last blast. The first masked man, the one Earl had slammed against the pavement, groaned and tried to get up. Earl turned his steel-blue gaze on him. "Stay down, kid. I ain't got time to explain physics to you." The gunman behind the fuel pump made his move. He lunged out, rifle raised, but he didn't expect Earl to move first. With a sharp flick of his wrist, Earl sent a wrench, which he had palmed from his toolbox, spinning through the air. The metal tool struck the gunman's wrist with a sickening crack, sending the rifle clattering to the pavement. "Ah!" The man staggered back, clutching his now useless hand. Earl was already closing the distance. In one swift motion, he grabbed the gunman by the collar and slammed him against the side of the truck. "You boys didn't do your homework," Earl growled. "You see, I ain't just some trucker. I ran security for convoys overseas. Afghanistan, Iraq. You ever hear of Route Irish?" The gunman's eyes widened in recognition. That was the deadliest road in the world for truckers back in the day. Earl leaned in. "I lost more friends than I can count on that road. You think a few punks like you scare me?" The gunman started shaking. From behind, the first man, still clutching his ribs, reached for a pistol tucked in his waistband. Earl didn't even turn around. Boom! A shot rang out, but not from Earl's gun. The bullet whizzed past Earl's head, striking the asphalt inches from the gunman's boot. From the other side of the truck stop, a group of truckers had gathered. One of them, an older man with a long gray beard, held up a smoking revolver. "You ain't the only one packing, Earl," the old trucker called out. The rest of the truckers moved in, boots crunching against gravel, forming a silent wall of steel and leather. The gunman's face went pale. He looked from Earl to the advancing truckers. There was nowhere left to run. The leader of the masked gang, still clutching his injured wrist, looked around at the encroaching wall of truckers. Their boots scraped against the asphalt, heavy and deliberate, like the sound of a closing prison cell. Earl stood tall in the center, his shotgun relaxed at his side. but his icy stare was locked on the trembling criminals. The second thug, the one who had just barely missed grabbing his pistol, was breathing erratically. He didn't expect resistance, and now he was facing a line of men who looked like they'd been forged in fire. Men who had spent decades surviving the highways, dealing with everything from thieves to cartel hijackers. "You're done," Earl muttered, voice low and deadly calm. But then, the sound of approaching engines, bright headlights cut through the darkness, the unmistakable growl of blacked-out SUVs roaring up the road. Earl's eyes narrowed. Oh, hell. The gang leader suddenly smiled. "You boys are tough, I'll give you that," he sneered. "But you don't know who you're dealing with." The SUVs skidded to a stop in a half-circle, dust swirling in the headlights. Doors swung open, and more armed men poured out. But these guys were different. They weren't just random street thugs. They moved with precision, tactical vests strapped to their chests, and their weapons weren't just for show. Cartel enforcers. Earl's grip tightened on his shotgun, but he didn't move. The truckers behind him exchanged glances, hands resting near their belts, some already gripping wrenches, crowbars, even tire irons. A heavily scarred man stepped forward from the SUVs, looking at the injured gang leader with thinly veiled disgust. "You needed help for this?" the scarred man muttered in Spanish. "A couple of truckers?" The gang leader looked down, ashamed. The scarred man sighed, then turned to Earl. "Old man, I don't know who you are, but you just made a very big mistake. That cargo in your truck, it belongs to us." Earl let out a slow breath. "That's so." He didn't take his eyes off the cartel boss, but behind him, something subtle was happening. The truckers were moving, quietly, slowly. One of them, a burly guy in a flannel shirt, nudged a foot against a metal plate near the gas pumps. A silent signal. Another trucker, leaning against a diesel rig, turned a dial on a radio clipped to his belt. It was a code, and it was already too late for the cartel. Headlights flared in the distance. Not just one or two. A convoy. The cartel gunmen barely had time to react before the roar of engines filled the air. From the highway, a line of semi-trucks was bearing down, not slowing, not stopping. Their horns blared in unison, a deafening signal of war. More truckers, more veterans, more fighters. The cartel enforcers spun, raising their weapons. But in that split second of hesitation, Earl moved first. His shotgun kicked like a mule, blasting the nearest cartel soldier right off his feet. Then everything exploded into chaos. The truckers rushed forward, steel and fists colliding with guns and armor. The cartel men weren't used to fighting like this, not against enemies who didn't back down. A wrench slammed into a gunman's skull. A crowbar cracked into another's knee, dropping him instantly. Earl grabbed the gang leader by the collar, slamming him against a truck. "Wrong damn trucker." The leader choked, eyes darting wildly as the cartel collapsed under the attack. Some tried to run, but the semi-trucks had boxed them in. One by one, they fell. The few survivors who managed to escape ran for their SUVs, peeling away into the night, leaving behind their fallen, their guns, and their pride. The gang leader was the last one left standing. Earl shoved him down onto his knees, staring him dead in the eyes. "You tell your bosses," he said, voice low. "Truckers don't scare easy." The gang leader scrambled to his feet, running as fast as he could toward the last SUV. The cartel's empire, shattered in a single night. As the dust settled, the truckers turned to each other, some shaking hands, some letting out deep, relieved breaths. Earl sighed, resting a boot on the side of his truck. "Damn kids," he muttered, loading another shell into his shotgun. Always picking the wrong fight. The desert was silent now. The night had settled over the gas station, the scent of diesel and burnt rubber hanging in the air. The cartel enforcers who had tried to take Earl's rig were either lying unconscious on the pavement or had fled into the darkness, tails between their legs. Earl stood next to his truck, shotgun still in hand. But he wasn't breathing hard. He'd been through worse. Around him, the other truckers were dusting themselves off, checking for injuries, making sure everyone was still standing. A younger driver, maybe in his mid-30s, stepped forward. He had watched the entire fight unfold, frozen in shock at how quickly the tides had turned. You knew they were coming, didn't you?" the young trucker asked, still catching his breath. Earl smirked and leaned against his truck. "Kid," he said, "when you've been on the road as long as I have, you don't wait for trouble. You listen. You feel it coming." The younger trucker looked around at the scattered bodies, the groaning cartel men who were still conscious. "How did you know you could count on all these guys?" he asked. Earl let out a deep breath, glancing at the other truckers, men who had been hauling freight long before GPS and cell phones, men who had spent nights at rest stops with nothing but a switchblade and their instincts to protect themselves. "Truckers take care of their own," Earl said simply. He walked over to his truck and pulled himself into the driver's seat. The others followed his lead, getting into their own rigs, the fight already behind them. To them, it was just another night, another roadblock, another lesson learned. The young trucker lingered, still watching as the convoy prepared to roll out. "Wait," he called after Earl. "What if they come back? The cartel doesn't just forget things like this." Earl looked at him, eyes dark but calm. "Then they'll make the same mistake twice." With that, he fired up the engine, the deep growl of the rig cutting through the silence. One by one, the other truckers did the same, their headlights slicing through the night. The younger driver stood there, watching as the convoy rolled out, dust kicking up into the sky. He wasn't the same man who had pulled into this gas station an hour ago. He had just seen something real, something they didn't teach in any trucking school, something that only men like Earl knew. The road wasn't just about getting from point A to point B. It was about knowing when to fight, when to stand your ground, and who to stand with. As the last truck disappeared into the distance, the young trucker turned toward his own rig. He wasn't sure what the road had in store for him, but after tonight, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to be caught unprepared, not ever again.